Hello, today is Friday, November 3rd, 2023, and welcome to episode 271 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's founder and executive director, Jamil Jaffer. I'm joined today by NSI's deputy executive director, Jessica Jones, and NSI senior fellows, Lester Munson and Morgan Venia. So today we are talking about nuclear arms control. The Russian Federation, in the form of Vladimir Putin, its president, has officially left the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. This is a nuclear agreement signed and ratified by a number of nations, not by the United States, importantly, signed but not ratified by the United States, which prohibits any type of nuclear explosion. And so the Russians have now opted out of it, suggesting they may be testing a nuclear device sometime in the near future. They have recently simulated a nuclear test in the conflict with Ukraine. So there are a lot of goings on that front. And there are new media reports suggesting the United States is considering negotiating with China over our joint nuclear arsenals. The United States, of course, has about 5,000, roughly 5,200 nuclear warheads. The Russians have 6,000 for their part. And the Chinese only have a few hundred, about 300 nuclear weapons, but they have announced plans in the near future to triple that to roughly 1,200 to 1,500 nuclear weapons. So what are we to make of all these nuclear goings on? Russian potential tests of nuclear weapons, them dropping out of the CTBT. The U.S., by the way, withdrew from the ABM treaty many years ago, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and more recently withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. claimed and has evidence that the Russians repeatedly violated. What do we make of all this? Lester, what do you think?
I dislike your false equivalence, Mr. Jaffer, and shame on you for putting this issue in that context.
What false equivalence, Les? What are you talking about?
Comparing Russia pulling out of the CTBT to the U.S. pulling out of the INF and other agreements, these are completely separate issues. Russia never complies with the international agreements that it does, in fact, agree to and ratify. So them pulling out, and I'm using air quotes for those of you not watching YouTube, pulling out of an agreement that, by the way, was never legally in force, and the U.S. never ratified, as you point out, but it's not really a super meaningful event in and of itself.
Well, to be fair, okay, the Russians, you're right. The Russians violate all sorts of treaty rules, right? But they didn't violate this one, right? Since they signed the CTBT and ratified it, they haven't tested a nuclear device. So at least this is one, at least as far as we know, they're in compliance with, right? No?
First of all, it's not in force. I don't know how you are in compliance with something that is not in force. You're the lawyer. I'll let you explain it to me. I think the reality is when it comes to nuclear testing, the reality is when it comes to nuclear testing, everyone is horrified by it. No one wants to see it. It would be wildly unpopular for Russia to start doing nuclear tests. Same for the United States. The real constraint on behavior is the reaction of the rest of the world. Note that North Korea does do nuclear tests and is a pariah for it. I don't think Russia's about to begin doing actual nuclear tests. So this is a lot of angels dancing on the head of a pin. And I do worry that the folks who are very much in favor of arms control agreements in our country, God bless them, sometimes there's utility there, are going to totally overreact to this story and attempt to change U.S. policy in reaction to it, which I think is what Putin was trying to do anyway.
Morgan, what do you think?
Well, I think Munson is running on all cylinders this morning.
A lot of coffee.
Thank you, Morgan.
A lot of coffee.
Thank you.
Look, I don't think it's much of a surprise that Putin, pulled out of CTBT. He's been signaling that he's going to do this since the war in Ukraine started. Putin has basically said that this move puts Russia on equal footing, so to speak, with other Western powers, whatever that means. And look, he simulated a nuclear strike last month. I don't think this is a surprise. I think multilateralist people who believe in, non-proliferation treaties are going to be
Tell us how you really think about that, Morgan.
Right? Look, I think multilateralists are going to be, infuriated by this and sort of in a rush to figure out, how the world is going to continue to function now that Russia pulled out of CTBT. But ultimately, I don't really think that this is frankly much of a big deal. I think this is Putin really trying to maintain his relevancy, particularly when Ukraine is starting to dip in the press and he's no longer the star of the show.
I like how Morgan, the former chief of staff to the U.S. ambassador to the UN, is accusing other people of being multilateralists, right? This is a rich moment. Jess, so, Les makes the point that none of this really matters. It's all about popularity, and it would be very unpopular if the Russians were to test a nuclear weapon. It's also very unpopular they invaded another country, Ukraine. So I don't think they're really into the popularity contest thing. What do you make of all this?
I mean, I agree with Morgan, unless this is a symbolic move. It doesn't really change anything. I mean, Putin's been keeping, the nuclear threat, since even before the invasion began, and every so often repeats it, raises it, so that it's always on, the folks, on everyone's mind. And, the timing of it all, we see, Zelensky and Ukraine going on a world tour to shore up support. We see, and it's not, I love Les's point that it's always not about the U.S. lens, but, we can't ignore the fact that here in the U.S., we see, poll came out this week, waning support for Ukraine. We have a new Speaker of the House that's trying to decouple support for Ukraine and Israel. So you can't help but think about that as we enter into the winter months. You have got the most senior Ukrainian military official saying we're coming out and saying we're reaching a stalemate. The most high level person to admit to that. And so the timing of it all, I don't know if it coincides, if it's meant to, but I mean, you can't help but to see the connections there.
Well, just what about this whole China move, though, right? I mean, we've seen the Biden administration be tough on China, impose all sorts of restrictions on exports and the like, and then they send Antony Blinken over there to visit. They send Gina Raimondo. Apparently, President Xi and President Biden are going to meet at some point in the near future. And now we're talking about negotiating nuclear deals with a country that has barely any nuclear weapons. What's going on there? Is that likely to happen? What do you make of that, Jess?
I mean, it seems like the news press, like there's going to be talks. That doesn't mean there's no expectation that anything is going to come of it. There's no, we're not entering into formal treaty with China anytime soon when it comes to non-proliferation. I think they're trying to find some areas, get into the press some good stories before Xi and Biden potentially meet at APEC.
Les, Morgan, any thoughts on the China play?
I think I think Jones makes some good points. It's way early. The administration, let's be clear, President Biden is up for re-election in a year. He wants to make it look like he's a statesman and that he can achieve things on the global stage. Starting arms control talks with China is a very plausible thing to do. But let's look at it closely. Let's examine the details. Let's see if the Chinese are actually serious about this. I suspect they are not. And it's much like the talks that we have with them on climate change, where they're just dangling like a false opportunity in front of us, and we tend to lurch at it every time. So I'm very skeptical, but it can't hurt to have the discussions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, given Biden's biggest foreign policy win this entire administration has been his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was that almost peace deal that blew up completely when Hamas conducted the horrific terrorist attacks of 10/7. Morgan, any last thoughts?
No, I think, look, I mean, when it comes to China and adding that to the agenda for this meeting, I think they're looking to fill space. I don't really take this too seriously, and I don't expect much to come of it. But they're welcome to have the talks if they're going to have talks for talk's sake. Well,
there you go. You've heard it here first. Nothing happened on the China nuclear front. That's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Monday, November 6th for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out the channel. You can see Morgan, Les, Jess, and all of us online on YouTube. Check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you hear or see on YouTube, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. We really appreciate when you do that, so make sure hit that subscribe button right now. Throw some comments in. Get in the game.
Positive
Have a great
comments.
weekend.